part 4 of a 9-part series about the physical and mental abuse Gerry experienced as a child and his Uncle Bill's intervention, which saved Gerry's life. Gerry had lived in Detroit for his first 15 and a half years, but now his parents were moving to a poor rural community north of Detroit. Just Keep Moving describes Gerry's last day in the only neighborhood he had ever known. Please welcome Gerry Courtney.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. My last day was March 7th, 1967, living in Detroit. And that morning, I wanted to make a special day of it. It was easy to conjure bad memories, but in this case, I wanted to find the poignant memories, the positive memories. I didn't really know how to do that, so I just started to walk around the neighborhood. Kept on walking until I came upon a burned out structure. It used to be called Antoine's Record Store. There were a lot of fond memories connected with that store. My Uncle Bill used to take me there every weekend, and I'd sort through the records and find some records, but there was another aspect to it that my uncle did. He played a game, and the game was this. As soon as we walked in, he'd say, okay, go find an album that has the skyline of New York on it. Go find an album that has a bunch of athletes on it. Go find an album that has a guy with bushy eyebrows and big hair. And so I picked these up, but as time went on, I began to understand the reason why he was doing that. The reason why he was doing that is he was opening up my ears and mind to all sorts of music that I never would have considered as a kid. I mean, he put me on to jazz saxophonist Archie Shepp and to Judy Garland and Louis Prima, all these people that, as they say, I would never listen to, but in fact, in the long run, it really enhanced my life. There was also a day, I think I was in 9th grade, and my uncle said, go find an album with the Hells Angels on the cover. So I looked around, tried to find an album that looked like that, and I picked up this one album that looked like that would fill the bill. The name of it was called Freak Out, and the artists were Frank Zappa and the Mother of Invention. And so I picked it up, went home, put it on. I started listening to it, and I really liked it. But inside the record notes, there was a quote, and the quote said, the present-day composer refuses to die, Edgar Varese. I love that quote. I started writing it out all over my school, the post office, bus stops, everywhere. There's only one problem. I didn't know what the hell it meant. I just liked it. So one day I went to Antoine. I said, Antoine, can you let me put this quote of Edgar Varese up on the wall? He goes, I'll do you one better. He then walked me over to the stacks and pulled out an album. And the album cover had this guy with gray, wiry hair, and bags under his eyes. Looked like me, really. But anyway, he handed me this, and I was thinking, wow, they finally made an album with a mad scientist. And then I looked at the corner, it said, Edgar Varese's music. And I almost fainted. And I said, how much are you going to sell this to me for? He goes, I'll give it to you. And he gave it to me. And I was like running home like I had $1 million on me. I got into my bedroom, put the record on the turntable, cranked up the volume like I always did, and I was ready for my mother to knock on the door and say, turn that music down. But instead, she kicked open my door and said, that's the most ungodly music I've ever heard in my life! Turn this off! And I picked up the album and go, this Edgar Varese is a god. Anybody who sent my mother into deeper insanity has to be a god. I mean, that album consisted of just nothing but drumming. Now my uncle, the next day, bought me a book, Edgar Varese. So I read that cover to cover. I didn't read any book cover to cover. I barely read a book, 3 pages in. I read it, and what really impressed me was that his mentors were all classical composers. Strauss, Grieg, Charles Ives, and I started to buy their albums. And before I knew it, I was buying classical music. I hated classical music, but I found a love of classical music because it was on my terms. And my Uncle Bill, and I went to my Uncle Bill and said, well, how come I used to hate classical music and now I love it? And he said, because you don't miss what you don't know. You learn a life's lesson. I mean, if you don't know anything about Picasso, you aren't going to miss him. If you don't know anything about biology, you aren't going to miss it. Took that lesson with me for the rest of my life. But there was another reason why I liked Antoine's. There was a girl in my class named Tammy Wells. And Tammy was really a good singer. She was winning all sorts of awards all over the Detroit area. And she'd come into Antoine's to get some ideas of what she wanted to do with her next performance. And she met my Uncle Bill, and they started talking, and over a while, he started offering her suggestions of different kinds of music she could sing. I mean, he put her onto Mahalia Jackson's gospel music and Nina Simone's African beat and Coco Taylor, Chicago blues. So it gave her a wider berth to try out her vocals. Well, anyway, the more that worked for her, the more she wanted to hang out with my Uncle Bill. The more she wanted to hang out with my Uncle Bill, the more I wanted to hang out with Tammy. And the more I wanted to hang out with Tammy, the more I wanted to have her as my girlfriend. And the more I wanted to have her as my girlfriend, I wanted to have a party at my house with girls yet. But there was a problem. Our house was too small. You couldn't have a party. But in the basement was large enough for that party. But that basement became a very, very contentious piece of property between my mother and myself. Every Saturday, somewhere in 8th grade, my mother came up with the idea that if you make him clean the basement, it'll teach him responsibility. I never saw the connection, really. But anyway, every Saturday I would pick up a broom and start sweeping the dirt this way. Then I'd take some rags and stuff it under the pillows of the couch. Then, doing that kind of stuff. And then I'd say things like, do I have to clean under the couch? Yes! Go into the other room. Do I have to clean in the utility room? Yes, we go through this every Saturday. After a while, my mother comes down. She looks around. She goes, this place looks worse than before you came down. And then we'd have a fight. Then I'd get grounded, and that was my weekends for most of my 8th grade. So anyway, my Uncle Bill knew how much I wanted to have that party, especially with Tammy. And so he started talking to my mom. Unbeknownst to me, he was talking to my mother about it. He says, you know something, I think I have a way to get Gerry to learn responsibility, which is important, without a big fight. And he can do it on his own. And the thing is, he'll do it on his own. I'll bet. She goes, all right, I'll bet. He's going to clean the basement on his own. He says, once he decides that he can have a party, that basement becomes his, not yours. And he'll clean it. And sure enough, the day of the party, the morning of the party, I went downstairs and man, I dusted, I swept, I deodorized, I did everything because I didn't want those girls to think I was ghetto. So Saturday night comes and everybody starts coming in. And I'm feeling really good. And then all of a sudden, I can't see Tammy. And she didn't show up. I felt crushed. Then I looked over and there's this girl over here and she's laughing at me. And I'm looking, it's Tammy. Now Tammy in our class used to have this gigantic afro, biggest afro in the school, and she used to get sent home because of it. And then her parents would show up and defend her, and then she'd come back into the school. And I thought, man, is that cool? She's a little bit of a rebel, and also her parents defend her. I had never heard of that before. So she's there, and she straightened her hair and dropped it over the right side of her face. And she still looked good, but it was a whole different look that I was used to. And so we went over to the couch and talked and laughed and did stuff. We would talk maybe for the first half of the party. And then the second half of the party, we danced every dance. And before I knew it, the party was over. And it must have been a good party because there were no fights. Everybody liked the food and everybody liked the music. So I sat on the couch, put my arm around Tammy, and we talked for a bit. And then I could hear the clump of my mother's confident steps coming down the stairs. And she walked in and she goes, "Are you Tammy?" And Tammy says, "Yes." She says, "Your brother's upstairs. He wants to take you home." So Tammy stands up, and now my mother sees that she has a real little mini skirt and shiny stockings. And my mother goes, "Whoa, you are exotic. Almost provocative." And then she puts her hand up for Tammy to stop. She goes, "Let me tell you something. I grew up with two brothers, and many times I heard them pleasuring themselves in the middle of the night. This guy is a chronic masturbator. And I'll tell you what he's going to do to you. He's going to impregnate you, and then he's going to leave you. Why? Because he's evil. And Tammy, this is not the neighborhood you want to raise a Mongol child in. Use your head." Tammy went up the stairs. I promised myself to make this a positive story, so I won't tell you the rest of the Tammy story. So I'm going to move on to another very positive guy. This guy's name was Mr. Jacks, and he lived as I walked away from Antoine's, came upon this apartment building. And Mr. Jacks didn't know when exactly he was born. He was either born in 1856 or 1857. The reason why he didn't know when he was born is because Mr. Jacks was born into slavery. And my uncle used to take him to church every day that my uncle was driving to his office. And it gave Bill a chance to talk to Mr. Jacks about his life. And I don't have the time, but I don't even have the memory to remember all these stories that Mr. Jacks told my uncle. But my uncle said, "That man is the most compassionate, interesting man I ever met." And my uncle met a lot of people like that. And on the way to work, Bill said, "What's the oldest memory you have?" And Mr. Jacks said, "Well, I remember we were little children who were brought out to the garden. And then they brought out this woman, and they horsewhipped her to death." That's his earliest memory. I'll tell you another part of Mr. Jack's story that I think you might not believe, but I really am not making this up. His job was, at 100 years old, was to move the shopping carts in this parking lot into the grocery store. The name of the grocery store was Dixie Fields. I'm not making that up. So Mr. Jacks did that in the afternoon. And at night, I think he must have been the only adult in our neighborhood who went to night classes. And he said, "I'm learning how to read better, write better, and learn how to cipher." And I thought, that's a cool name. I never heard that, cipher. And he loved to teach the kids on the block what he was learning in the school. And I'll give you two examples. We'd always follow Mr. Jacks around because he had a bag of hard candy, and we were just waiting when he was going to bust it open so we could have some. And we're talking to him, and then on the street, and it was a side street, this car is really coming down the highway really fast, or the street really fast, and this little kid runs right in front of the car. And then you hear the like that. We all have our attention looking there. The kid made it across the street okay. And then Mr. Jacks goes, the car stopped abruptly. That's a education word. It means quick, fast, sudden. And we go, "Yes, Mr. Jacks." "No, would you give us some candy?" But the story that he told that really stuck with me in my life, was Miss Minnie on our block had a baby, and she came out to show Mr. Jacks. And Mr. Jacks took the infant in his swollen, cracked, blue-black hand and put that little hand in his palm. And he looked at it, and he said, boys, come here. This is the cycle of life. I'm all spent. But this little one, she's going to have a wonderful life. You guys are going to protect your freedom so she can make a wonderful life, right? They said, yes, Mr. Jacks. You ain't going to give up on your freedoms. No, Mr. Jacks. And I'm thinking, when's he going to bring out the candy? But he did bring out the candy, but that wasn't the thing for me. The thing for me was that he was talking like that to a bunch of young kids. No adult talk was like that. Well, I reluctantly moved away from the apartment building and went back to our street. And at the top of the street was my best friend's house. His name was Leroy Smith. And Leroy house now had new lumber across the front. It was abandoned. Kept on walking down to the end of the block, and there was the place where I could get some fond memories. It was in an alley. And we was told by a lot of the adults, do not go in that alley. Somebody was murdered in that alley a few years ago. That made us all want to go in there. And so we did. And when we found a German Shepherd who was dead, we found a waterlogged gun, we found bullets, we found cash, we found coins, we found all sorts of stuff in that alley. We loved it. And we used to see that alley heading out to the west. And that alley was filled with broken glass, beer bottles, and soda bottles, and perfume bottles, any kind of bottle was all crushed. And you look down there, and you look to the west, and when the sun was setting, and it lit up those broken bottles, and it looked like we were walking on jewels. And we walked down there and we fantasize about someday we're gonna take this jeweled highway and we're gonna find a better place. And we'll take Uncle Bill with us too. So we did that. This particular day, we found some candy. And Leroy opened it up, tasted it, he goes, this isn't stale, this is good. We were so transfixed on that bag of candy that we didn't see the two squad cars coming down, one side of the alley and then the other. And they told us to get against the wall, which the wall was the back end of a Shell gas station. And there were crevices in the cinder block that constituted the building. And we stood up against the wall and they asked us the regular questions, where do we live, how old were we, where are we going to school, all that kind of stuff. Then after they asked those questions, the officer was with me, took me to the front of his squad car, and I sat down, and I said, what are you doing? What did he do? And he goes, we can't have him living on his own. His mother and his sister have been arrested, and he can't live on his own. Don't worry about it. He'll go into the system, and we'll take care of him. And I said, but, you know, he could live with us. He comes over to our house lots of times and spends time with my Uncle Bill. The officer said, couldn't you have found a better friend? And I said, you don't know. He knows a lot. He's a good writer. I knew it was nothing I could do, so all I did was stare at him against the wall and go, run. And he ran. I couldn't believe that he heard me somehow. He took about 3 steps before the officer grabbed his face, shoved it into the wall, and then ran it across that rough cinder block wall. And I was looking now at chunks of his face in those crevices with the smear of blood over that. He handcuffed Leroy, put him in the back seat, and drove down that jeweled alley. And I never saw him again. I was staring at that. I must have had, I don't know what expression I had, but I just stared. And the officer next to me said, this is tough. I remember the first time I was on the force, came upon a car accident. And there were 3 bodies in there so mangled, you couldn't even tell who they were. And I turned around and threw up. And my captain said, we're not gonna make it 2 days on this job. You've gotta find some way to make it through. And what I suggest is that you laugh. Every time you see something, just laugh. And I'm looking and staring. He goes, would you try that? Would you just laugh? No! I was now thinking, Leroy had great poems, great songs. I gotta think of one right now. I gotta think of it, and I couldn't. But he did love one song. He used as kind of a motto. It was called Trouble Coming Every Day by Frank Zappa. It was ironically on the same album that had the Edgar Varese quote. Zappa wrote it 60 years ago to chronicle the uprising in in LA. And those words could be transferred to the riot that we were going to have in Detroit in about 5 months. It could also be transferred to the uprising that took place in New York, Newark, South Central, Rodney King, Minneapolis, George Floyd, and who knows, maybe what's coming in our fall, the election's coming up. Anyway, I'm only going to tell you the last verse of the song, Trouble Coming Every Day by Frank Zappa. And we sit around at home and watch this thing begin, but I don't think there'll be many to see it really end. Because the fire in the street ain't like the fire in the heart. And don't you know, in the eyes of many, that this can start in any street of any towns, any state of any clown decides now the time to fight for some ideal he thinks is right, and if millions more agree, there ain't no great society as it applies to you and me. Our country isn't free. And the law refused to see that all you'll ever be is just some lousy janitor unless your uncle owns a store. You know that 3 in every 4 will not amount to anything more than watching rats run across the floor and make up songs about being poor. To all the 2024 versions of Leroy Smith,